The water company called me twice in 1 week, and the second time they weren't asking about payment. "Ma'am, are you aware your usage this month is 4 times your average?" I lived alone, no pool, no leaking toilet. I said I'd check the basement. Before hanging up, the woman added something odd. "You might want to check the wall too. We've had a few calls like this on your block." I bought the row house in August. My first house, narrow brick, on a street that was half renovated, half boarded up. The block still had that Baltimore rhythm. Some houses gutted and flipped with granite counters, others plywood-eyed, waiting for money to notice them. Row houses like mine shared party walls with the houses on either side. A construction style from the 1900s, when whole blocks went up as a single structure and were later subdivided. My inspector had flagged a patched section of basement wall, drywall that didn't match the surrounding brick, and called it cosmetic. Prior repair, no concern. I hadn't thought about it since. I went down with a flashlight. No leak. But there was a smell near that patch, mineral and metallic, coming from the shared wall with 214, the vacant row house next door. I pressed my ear against it. Nothing. I felt stupid and went to bed. 3 nights later I woke at 2:14 a.m. to a grinding sound below my bedroom floor. Steady, mechanical, gone in 90 seconds. I told myself it was the water heater and didn't check. The plumber ran a dye test and found nothing wrong with my pipes, but tapped the patched wall and frowned. Hollow, then not hollow, like there's something on the other side, not just brick. He suggested I ask the city about the vacant house next door, since shared walls sometimes came with legal complications outside his job. 214 turned out to be owned by a Delaware LLC, tied up in tax sale for 2 years, unremarkable for the block. But when I mentioned the grinding to my other neighbor Denise, she went quiet. "You hear it too?" I thought it was my house settling. "It's worse on trash night." Trash night. Every Tuesday 6 a.m. collection trucks, loud enough to cover anything. The following Tuesday I stayed up. At 5:40 a.m. before the trucks, I heard footsteps in the alley. Ordinary, unhurried. Then 214's old cellar hatch scraping open, and 20 minutes later, closing, right as the first truck turned onto the block. I didn't confront anyone. I photographed a white cargo van idling 2 doors down, and wrote down the plate. The next week I pried back the loose drywall patch myself. Behind it wasn't insulation. It was a rough opening cut straight through the shared brick, framed with scrap lumber. Dust settled in old seams, but the cut edges still pale and recent. Through the gap I saw 214's basement, a folding table, a bench grinder bolted to plywood, and a dozen catalytic converters stacked along the far wall, some still greasy with exhaust soot, others already cut open and stripped bare. I understood the water bill then. 214 had been shut off by the city 18 months earlier. My basement spigot was the only running water reachable from inside that connected structure. They were hosing down parts and tooling the grinder through my line, running power off a shared junction box nobody had ever properly split. When the block was subdivided, I backed away and called the police. While I waited, I found a damp spiral notebook, wedged behind a stud. Dates, initials, 6 addresses within 4 blocks. 3 of them houses I recognized as recently sold to first-time buyers like me. Not just my basement. A route. The officers weren't surprised. Converter theft rings had been hitting Baltimore for 2 years, using shared party walls to work unnoticed. The first time someone found the workshop, instead of just the empty shell. The crew likely rotated between vacant properties with live utility taps, moving product out during trash truck noise. They caught 2 men a week later running the same setup through a different shared wall 3 blocks over. The van's plate matched, but the notebook worried the detective more than the men did. Somebody scouted these houses. Somebody knew which basements had working water and power, and which owners wouldn't notice for a while. He asked who'd patched my wall before I bought the place. The same contractor, it turned out, who'd done pre-sale repairs on 2 other addresses in the notebook. They never found him. I moved out the following spring, not because of what happened, I told myself, just because it was time. I still think about the notebook. 6 addresses, 3 of them already gone through this before me, each owner seeing only their own small, isolated mystery, never realizing they were one stop on somebody else's route. My aunt's house had one rule she never explained. Never let anyone into the basement alone. I found the sticky note on the breaker box 3 weeks after she died, faded but legible. At the time I thought it was superstition. By February, I understood it as the smartest thing she ever wrote down. I inherited the Craftsman in October, a green two-story near Mount Tabor, built in 1911 with a century-old stone foundation. The basement smelled like every old Portland basement does: cedar, mineral, rain that never quite dries. Ken lived 2 doors down, an old friend of my aunt's who ran a small real estate flipping business. 2 houses on the block already wore his fresh paint and realtor signs. He offered to keep an eye on the place, the way I did for her, and I, new to the neighborhood and still grieving, said yes without thinking much of it. First, a box of canning jars moved to the far wall. I assumed I'd misremembered. Then, by late November, a mustiness that hadn't been there before. Ken recommended an inspector, Dale. Honest work, I've used him on 3 flips. Dale found moisture elevated but not alarming, and suggested a dehumidifier. It helped for a week, then the smell came back worse, and the original sump pump, recently serviced by Ken before I'd even moved in, started tripping at odd hours, running for 10 minutes on nights it hadn't rained. I kept a log, not because I suspected anything yet, just because the pattern bothered me. Every overnight sump run without rain landed within a day or 2 of Ken mentioning he'd swung by to check the pipes while I was at work. In December I had a second inspector, not one of Ken's recommendations, just a name off a neighborhood forum. Come look. He was blunter than Dale. Your foundation's dry, he said, running a meter along the same wall Dale had flagged. Whatever's causing that reading, it's not coming through the stone. Somebody's spraying this wall down, or your sump's being run artificially. He showed me the readings side by side. Consistent dampness in a 6-foot section near the sump pit, nowhere else in the basement. I didn't confront Ken. I'm still not entirely sure why. Some instinct told me that whatever this was, it wasn't finished, and tipping him off would only make him more careful. Instead, I watched. His business card turned up in the paperwork of 2 other estate sales on the block, both to out-of-state heirs who'd never lived in Portland, both flipped by his company within months of closing, both with documented moisture remediation, performed right before the price got renegotiated down. In January, I put a cheap camera on the sump pit and mentioned to a coworker, loudly, standing near my open kitchen window, the one facing Ken's yard, that I might just sell the place. I never planned to. I wanted to see who'd hear it. The camera caught Ken letting himself in through the basement hatch at 11 p.m. with my aunt's old spare key. He knelt at the pit, adjusted the float switch with a screwdriver, and left 14 minutes later. The pump ran for 2 hours straight. I didn't confront him the next morning when he waved from his porch. I copied the footage, printed the permit records, and brought everything, plus my aunt's sticky note, to a real estate attorney. The read was careful, procedural, unsatisfying in the way real answers often are. Manufactured moisture damage to depress a sale price wasn't a clean criminal charge on its own, but combined with unauthorized entry and fixture tampering. It was enough to build a civil case, enough to get his spare key legally revoked and the sump pump inspected by the city. I never had the confrontation I kept almost having in my head. I sent the footage through the attorney instead, and 2 weeks later, learned Ken's company had quietly withdrawn offers on 2 other houses on the block, both with moisture issues reported by Dale within the past year. I still live in the house. I changed the locks myself instead of asking a neighbor to help. On quiet nights, when a car idles too long outside, I go check that the hatch is bolted, not because I think he'll come back, but because I've stopped assuming I'd notice if he did. My aunt's sticky note is still on the breaker box. I never took it down. I think she wrote it because she knew something about him too, and never told anyone, and I wonder some nights how long that had been going on before I ever moved in. The contractor's business card is still in my kitchen drawer. I keep meaning to throw it away, and I keep not doing it, like it's evidence I might need someday. We'd built the storm shelter into the corner of our basement the September before, after a near miss the previous spring sent my daughter Callie and me into a bathtub with a mattress over our heads, listening to a tornado pass close enough to strip shingles off our roof. I wasn't doing that again. A guy at work recommended a contractor, cheaper than the big franchise outfits. Does it right. Used to work storm shelter installs down in Texas before he came up here. We got a quote thousands less than the competing bids. Poured concrete walls, a steel door rated to federal standards on paper, and a certificate suitable for an insurance discount. I filed it away and didn't think about it again until May. The sirens went off at 4:52 p.m., Callie home from school, the sky gone the color of a bruise. We knew the drill. Down the stairs, into the shelter, door sealed, radio crackling. The first 20 minutes were routine dread. Then the radio cut to static, and the pressure spiked hard enough that Callie grabbed my arm. That's when I noticed the water, a thin sheet along the north wall, the one backing the yard, where the contractor had told me drainage was handled, don't worry about it. It rose past my shoelaces in under a minute. I'd noticed something off about that wall back in September and let it go. Anchor bolts on the shelter's steel frame that were a different, cheaper gauge than the paperwork specified. The contractor had waved it off as a supply chain swap. I'd wanted to believe him, because the alternative was tearing the whole thing out. Now, with the house groaning above us in a way I'd never heard a house groan, I understood exactly what those bolts meant. The frame shuddered with each gust that found its way down the stairwell, a fine grid of concrete dust sifting from around the door hinges every time it did. The door, which was supposed to seal flush against 6-inch concrete, had a gap along its top edge wide enough to see the stairwell light flicker through it. "Dad, the door's not closing right," Callie said, and she was right. Under the pressure and vibration, the frame had shifted just enough that it no longer sat true in its jam. I threw my weight against it, and it held, barely, but I understood then that held wasn't the same as secure. I got Callie low, away from the door, and used the short pry bar from the shelter's toolkit, for exactly the kind of emergency I'd hoped never to need it for, to wedge the frame back against the slab where I could see daylight leaking through the gap at the base. It wasn't a fix. It was a stall, buying maybe a few more minutes of the door being trustworthy, rather than decorative. The worst of it lasted maybe 4 minutes, though it felt considerably longer. A sound above us like the house losing an argument, ending in a heavy grinding crash, I later learned was the garage roof folding into the driveway. The water kept rising past my ankles, cold enough that I lost feeling in my toes, before it started to recede. Then as suddenly as it started, the pressure eased, the sound thinned to ordinary wind and rain, and the radio crackled back with a shaken but steady all clear for our zip code. We waited 20 minutes before I pried the door open. The stairwell was intact, the kitchen above wasn't, a gap of gray sky where the roof had been. We were lucky, plainly, with nothing to do with anything I'd done right. The insurance adjuster who came out 2 days later took one look at the sheared bolts, shouldn't happen with a properly rated anchor system, and asked for the contractor's paperwork. A call from his truck later, he told me the license number on my certificate belonged to a company suspended by the state 8 months before my install, for unrelated violations. The contractor's number was disconnected within the week. A local news story, tipped by a state inspector, described uncertified storm shelters installed across 3 counties under at least 2 business names, including near the bottom, a mention of a family in a neighboring county whose shelter had fully collapsed in the same storm system. We rebuilt the shelter that summer, properly, inspected by the county. I still keep the old card in my drawer. I tell myself it's so I check paperwork more carefully next time. Mostly I think I keep it so I don't forget how close safest room in the house came to meaning the opposite. And how many other families that same afternoon found out the same thing the hard way.